The session was supposed to be chaired by myself and Francesco Montoni, but Professor Atzma-Rus from Leiden kindly stepped in for Professor Montoni. I'll ask the colleagues from the pharma industry to introduce themselves once they start with addressing the questions. It's also important to understand, for compliance reasons, that we cannot just have an open answer, a question and answer session where, you can expect that industry just responds to any question. There are certain guidelines about this, and I think, we have to respect that this is just the framework that we are working with. So the colleagues from industry know about the questions. We have about 2 to 3 minutes per answer. Annemieke is an excellent timekeeper as well, internationally known for that. So we will move on. You can also see this questions in the background on the slides. So we could move to the next slide, please. Oh, I can do that actually. Yes, there it is. I'll control this in Annemieke. So this is a question for Roche. And so what is your view on how clinical effectiveness and value for money are appraised by public bodies here in the UK and beyond? Are there any changes you would like to see?
Thank you for the question. Brilliant question. My name's Wendy Kane. I'm a rare conditions partner at Roche, and we work with Sarepta on the gene therapies. So in answer to the question, I think one of the things that we have to definitely acknowledge here in the UK is that we have a world-leading National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. They have a very, very difficult role in terms of trying to balance, both in terms of the value of money and also in terms of looking at the best care, both for individuals and also for society as a whole. In 2021, they set out a very, very ambitious vision. And with that, we've got both health technology assessments and also highly specialized technology approaches. So there's 2 different ways in which they look at some of the medications that they review. Unfortunately for us, in terms of looking at the health technology assessments, they haven't been set up to actually look at treatments like gene therapies where there is a one-off upfront cost which would have a long-term benefit. So that review isn't there. The other alternative, which is the highly specialized technologies, unfortunately, Duchenne muscular dystrophy doesn't fit into that criteria. And the reason being is it has to be 1 in 50,000 incidents of the condition. And there are much more boys in the UK than that. So unfortunately, that doesn't fit either. One of the other ways in which we could look at it is the Innovative Medicines Fund. But really, in terms of looking at what that could give us, unfortunately, it wouldn't give us any more review or consideration. So it would have to be under the highly specialized, the HTA route. But one of the things that we do want to say is that we have to come together to actually try and solve this particular problem. And that's bringing both NICE and NHS England and pharma industry partners, as well as other stakeholders, to make sure that we can reach a conclusion that would actually bring more innovative treatments to more patients in a much faster way across the UK. Now, one of the things they have put in place more recently is called a HTA lab. And this is one where they're reviewing the allocation of resources and time that they spend.
Talking about time.
On individual, sorry, I'm nearly there, on individual treatments. And what that means is that for those that are less complex or have less issues, they're going to be finding a much faster route for those to go through so that they can devote much more of their time to the complex things that we know that we will bring into their tables pretty soon.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
Exactly 3 minutes. So the next question is for PTC. What work is being done to make sure medicines for rare diseases are available and affordable for the NHS? And we have 2 microphones.
Yeah, but we don't have the PTC
we
colleague here.
We don't have the PTC.
We're trying to track him down until we do.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's move on.
Let's move on. Okay, so now I get the long one. For Sarepta, the COVID pandemic and rollout of new vaccines has shown us how the pharmaceutical industry and regulators can work at a very rapid pace to secure wider public health benefits without delay. Are there any lessons to be applied to the rare diseases and specifically the Duchenne space when it comes to trialing and rolling out new treatments?
Thank you for the question. I'm James Richardson. I'm the Global Program Lead for our Duchenne gene therapy development at Sarepta. Yeah, I mean, I wrote down yes on my notes.
Excellent timekeeping.
But then I thought maybe not. I don't know. It feels like it's human nature not to learn from these things, right? We think we are. We think it's amazing. It's got to build on this, and then we all revert back to type after a few months or years. So there are three things I think with kind of decreasing levels of stickiness that have changed, and we have to make sure they stay changed. I think the first one's pretty universal, I think, to everyone here, probably more or less, that we communicate much more freely and easily digitally. We are much more comfortable having meetings over various video conference programs. And I think that, like, as anodyne as that sounds, that actually helps, you know? It means that we don't necessarily have to wait a month for another R&D committee to be convened. You can do something ad hoc. As a company, we can make decisions faster because we're not bound by schedules. It's a little bit boring, but I think it actually has stuck and actually does help. There's something else called decentralized trials. It's quite trendy in industry. It really means trying to take away some of the burden of going to sites to get your assessments done for a study. And again, I think that's something that, like, COVID has catalyzed, a little bit like the digital communications. We had them before, but we didn't really use them. Same for this kind of remote assessment. We had it before, but it was a little bit difficult to get it stuck. And I think that from Sarepta's perspective, we were forced to do this during the pandemic. We were forced to do some of our physical assessments remotely. And I think that helped us overcome and actually produce data to show this works, right? We've got some great internal data that we're in the process of publishing to show that these remote assessments are very strongly correlated to ones done in person. And I think as we go into the future, that will give us opportunity to do more assessments, takes the burden off the patient, which is fantastic, of coming into the hospital, but it also means that maybe we can have richer data sets to take to regulators and take to payers. The final thing, and then I'm doing for time, but this is kind of like a little hypothetical because I really hope it sticks, but I'm not sure. First of all, COVID vaccines were approved very quickly because regulators, developers, governments put all of their resources into it, right? We're not going to do that equitably for all rare diseases. But the other thing they did is they worked very cooperatively. Regulators and less so payers, but regulators and companies talked together very early on, lots of interaction. And I think there are lots of models that exist for that interaction globally between payers, regulators, and sponsors, but they've not necessarily been picked up as quickly. So I think that if we can build on this interactive, early approach, communicate, don't take a data set that doesn't work to a regulator or payer 10 years after you started the trial, that can only be beneficial.
Okay, thank you very much, James. We'll move on to Santhera. What is the biggest challenge pharmaceutical companies face in approving drugs in the UK? That's an easy one.
In 3 minutes.
Thank you. Now I'll save a bit of time for you. I'm Geert-Jan van Daal. I'm responsible for the Santhera affiliates in Europe and for market access. And so I'm a Dutch physician, so I'm looking at it from a bit from the outside. And I think there's good news and bad news here. The good news is that Brexit actually changed the system for the good, in the sense that the new procedure is shorter, far shorter than the EMA procedure, roughly half of the time. And so, well, the downside is that you have to submit a separate dossier, but that's only work. That can be done. That's not an enormous challenge. Technically, not so complicated. But as my colleague from Roche already pointed out, the big challenge is pricing and reimbursement. And I won't elaborate on the different routes again. But fact is that the English system is not really adapted to the assessment of orphan drugs. And the problem there is that innovative treatments often do not reach patients simply because not enough data can be collected for those groups. And that's a pity, because then English patients do not get what they deserve, whereas they would get it in other countries. Yeah?
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent timekeeping, actually.
Okay,
So solid bioscience is not represented here. I'm not sure if any of the other colleagues would want to respond, and I understand if you wouldn't. Have a look at
responding, and Wendy can cut me off.
So why are some drugs approved in the US and not in the UK?
So, I mean, there are different regulatory pathways, is the kind of the boring but quick answer. And maybe, not I'd mention the drug, but Sarepta has a good example, I think, of this with the drugs approved in the US and not Europe. And those drugs in the US are approved on biomarkers that, whilst you can get a drug approved in Europe and the UK on a biomarker, the standard of evidence to support the link between that biomarker and outcomes of importance to patients, and Volker talked earlier about death, about how a patient feels, about how often you visit a hospital. That's a much higher bar in Europe and the UK. The US has a different view, let's say, that will let a lower bar to start with, but will ask the companies to, whilst the drug is available, to create data to demonstrate that this biomarker is also having an impact on those things that are directly important to patients, whether that's mortality, how you feel. So I mean, sometimes it doesn't happen at all, and sometimes it just creates a delay. So sometimes we'll see drugs that are approved faster in the US, but it is very much, I think, the ambition of our company, and I think all the companies here, to make these drugs available globally.
maybe I can add that. Yeah. But it's also happening the other way around, that there's drugs that are approved in the UK and in Europe that are not approved in the US. I think it's not always, the wrong way around.
Could I add one more remark here? In all honesty, every now and again it's also a company's choice. And I hate to say it, but often US-based companies consider Europe as a very complex environment, and not worth the effort. So that's, it's a bit of a shame, but that's also the reality.
And it's probably also important to mention that the biggest drug market in the world is the US, without any question. So,
price differences obviously play a role.
I'll do the next one, and I'll stop meanwhile. So to Pfizer, we hear great outcome of some therapeutic drugs being evaluated in clinical trials, but cannot access them. Can you address why it takes so long to get a drug from a clinical trial to the markets?
Thank you for the question. I'm Ione Willacott. I'm a medical affairs manager within the rare disease team at Pfizer UK. So following results being available from clinical trials, there are several processes which a medicine needs to go through before it can reach patients. And the first step is a review by regulatory agencies who have to assess the quality, the effectiveness and the safety of a medicine, and this process can take several months. And if the regulatory agencies decide to approve marketing of that medicine, called marketing authorization, then the next step is a health technology appraisal, as has been mentioned, to ensure that the medicine provides both clinical benefit but also value for money or cost effectiveness for the NHS. And in England, the HTA process is carried out by NICE, who then produces guidance, including a recommendation about whether the medicine should be funded on the NHS. So, although NICE aims to publish its final guidance for all new medicines within 90 days of marketing authorization, in reality, the HTA process can last much longer than this. Even after NICE has made a positive recommendation for a medicine, NHS England then must provide funding for both the medicine and service setup, and this has to happen within 90 days. So, Pfizer believes that all patients should be able to access medicines as quickly as possible after marketing authorization, irrespective of how rare a disease is. But there is a real need to speed up access to medicines for rare diseases like Duchenne. And as has already been discussed, NICE has these two processes to assess a medicine under HTA, the single technology appraisal, or STA, and then the highly specialized technology, or HST route. So although an STA is used to assess most medicines, recent research conducted by Pfizer showed that for non-cancer rare disease medicines assessed through STA, they took a longer time to reach a decision and were more likely to reach a negative decision by NICE compared with medicines for more common diseases. So the HST route, on the other hand, allows for a more flexible and pragmatic approach to uncertainty and a higher cost-effectiveness threshold, which can often be really important for rare disease medicines. But, as has been discussed, there are quite strict criteria for HST, so this route is often not possible. And in other European countries, health systems can provide more rapid access to treatments by funding innovative medicines before the HTA process has been finalised. And similar systems could be applicable and put in place in the UK, but currently these are not available. So at Pfizer are committed to working with organisations, so the regulatory agencies MHRA and EMA, NICE, NHS England, to speed up access to medicines. And we hope that by working closely with these organisations, as well as with patients, their families, patient organisations, and caregivers, we hope that patients will obtain faster access to medicines, including for rare diseases like Duchenne.
Thank you very much, Ioni. And so the next question is for Edgewise. How can the community and patient organizations help to expedite the journey of a drug to the market?
Hi, my name is Joanne Donovan. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Edgewise. I apologize for my voice. I hope that it manages to escape the microphone here. So I think that advocacy organizations are incredibly helpful in moving things from across clinical trials and ultimately to the people that are the ones who need the drug. And a good example of that is this kind of a meeting, being able to hear the voice of the patient, to be able to understand what is important to patients, how do we design clinical trials, and take advantage of that information that we get from sitting here and hearing you in these kinds of sessions and talking. So that's very important. A second area where the advocacy organizations are extremely important is communications. So in terms of understanding what the drug is, what it does, how it works, and what patients are potentially eligible for that, helping get the word out is very important. And that happens through meetings like this. It happens through webinars. It happens through advocacy organizations putting together information so that patients have, or parents have things at their fingertip. And I think like the DMD hub is a great example of that, being able to look and seeing what are the characteristics of drugs that are in investigational trials at this point and being able to make decisions. The advocacy organizations are important also in funding things. Very early on, there have been a number of places where they add seed money to companies at a very early stage. And that actually works to leverage the finances and bring more money in. So it's not that they're funding the whole thing, but by providing seed money, that encourages and facilitates getting additional money to advance the drug, which we know makes things happen faster, as we heard. So recruiting for trials through all of the information that goes out is also incredibly important to be able to answer questions on our behalf and to help get the word out for things like that. So it's a many-faceted way that advocacy
Time.
organizations can help facilitate that process.
Thank you very much, Joanne. The next question is to Santhera. What factors determine how many participants can partake in a trial and how is it agreed?
Thank you. That's good for timekeeping, this question, because it's a relatively straightforward technical process. And at an early stage, once you have an idea what a drug should do at an early stage of the development, you try to get an idea of the effect size a different sort of dosing schedule gives you for particular patients. And that effect size is then used when designing a bigger study to calculate what, to do a power and sample size calculation. And that's, the outcome is essentially very straightforward. It tells you how many patients you would need to demonstrate an effect and have statistical significance at that level. So that is for the overall study. And underlying this question, there may be like, okay, how does it work in the different centers or in the different countries? That's a bit less transparent because that's very often, it involves the presence of expert centers, their experience with a given topic, the cost per country, cost per site. So that is then there's a bit of a bias in there, I would say.
Great, thank you very much. That was good timekeeping indeed. So in summary, the bigger the effect size, the fewer patients you need to show that the drug is working. So we'll come to the next question for Pfizer. Are you open to patient family input in trial protocol?
Yes, definitely. Pfizer is committed to working closely with patients and families, caregivers, and involving them, and as well as patient organisations, really, to better understand their needs, their priorities. And this is really essential to ensure that clinical trial design, the protocols, the outcomes that are being measured are meaningful and appropriate for the people that these medicines are being designed to benefit. And so we involve patients, family members and caregivers in discussion panels to gather and validate insights into our clinical trial development programme. And topics discussed include, for example, the perception of benefits and risks associated with a medicine, the trial design itself and the protocol content. And this helps to better inform the potential impact of the trial on patients and their families' everyday lives. It helps to inform the meaningfulness of outcomes assessed in the trial. It highlights factors that might affect trial recruitment, and it also identifies knowledge gaps and potential education opportunities. And Pfizer also meets with community advisory boards to discuss and gain feedback on its programme. And there are caregiver representatives on these boards from multiple countries, including from the UK. In addition to that, patient advocates are present on the external data monitoring committees and the steering committees for Pfizer's clinical trial development programs. And this ensures that representation of the patient voice is heard and represented across several trial processes. And finally, we also have a protocol optimization team at Pfizer, and this gives clinical trial teams the chance to kind of pressure test their design, their protocol, and other materials and gain feedback from patients and caregivers. And this team has worked in the UK with various UK organisations like the NIHR Patient Engagement Service and other UK patient organisations as well to make sure that the patient voice and caregiver voice is heard and reflected in trial design, and this is really important to us.
Thank you very much. Next one for Joanne again. During clinical trials, especially the longer ones, if there is no efficacy shown, is it ethical to continue the trial? And Volker already said the bigger the effect size, the shorter the trial, but the smaller the effect size, either the bigger the trial or the longer the trial. So, Joanne.
Yes. So the answer is clearly no. But I'm not going to give you back all that time. And so how does the company make sure that that doesn't happen? And there are various ways of looking at the data during the trial to make sure that certainly the individual investigator always keeps the best interest of the patient at heart, and always has the opportunity to essentially to stop that trial in that patient if they don't feel that if they feel like they're having unreasonable adverse events. That's part of every protocol, that there are reasons to stop a particular patient. To look at the whole trial, there is a safety data monitoring committee for all of these trials that is composed of independent people who are experts, pediatric neurologists typically, as well as usually a representative from the community on that, and a statistician. And what they do is periodically during the trial, they look at the data they can look at it in an unblinded fashion. The company can't do that as you're going along. But this group looks at the data, they know who's taking the drug, who isn't taking the drug, and they can ask that question, is this ethical? And they do. Is it ethical to continue the trial? So typically those data safety monitoring board reviews are held several times a year. And most often they result in the trial continuing. They feel it is ethical to continue the trial. And it may be, as you said, quite a long time for that trial. What happens occasionally, and we've actually seen that a couple times in the community, and it happens as a big surprise because we don't expect that. We've all had good reasons for doing a trial. And they can provide the information that, no, the trial should stop. It is futile to continue the trial. It's not going to be powered. It's not going to be able to give a positive answer. And that then comes to the community, and unfortunately, it comes as a surprise to the community because you're not expecting the results of the trial. So that is, in fact, a safety measure to prevent a trial from continuing when it doesn't have the possibility of offering benefit to the patients. And that is one of the several mechanisms for maintaining the safety of the participants in any trial.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Yeah, excellent. So the next question is for Ione again. It would be helpful for families to help them make decisions about clinical trial participation if we could find out from pharma companies what the uptake is and how many they need to fill the trial. Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so it's a really important question. And so equity and access to clinical trials starts with people being able to find out about clinical trials and also understand trial information. And at Pfizer, we work hard to share relevant and appropriate information about trials with communities globally, but also working within country-specific rules and regulations. And patient organisations play a really critical role in appropriately relaying trial information to the communities and are invaluable resources for both supportive services and also information about current clinical research. And we continue to work closely with patient organisations in each country, including in the UK. Regarding how many participants are needed to fill a specific clinical trial, this information is often listed on the website clinicaltrials.gov against that trial. Additionally, information about current clinical trials for people with Duchenne in the UK is listed on other websites, including the total required recruitment numbers. For example, as mentioned earlier, the DMD Hub Clinical Trials Finder. We're unable to discuss specific trial recruitment numbers and progress for specific trials because trial recruitment is not a steady process. And at any one time, there might be people thinking about taking part, being screened, being enrolled. So if we were to communicate a specific number at a specific time, this could be actually misleading. We don't maintain a list of individuals who are interested in participating in a trial, and we're not authorised to engage directly with patients and caregivers who are thinking about taking part in a trial. So we're also not involved in trial participant selection. So each trial site manages trial recruitment and enrolment completely independently of Pfizer. So if people are interested in taking part in a clinical trial, we would advise them to go and speak to the healthcare professional to identify and consider a trial site that works best for them. And if discussing trial participation, we would encourage them to discuss this with their families, their caregivers, their clinical healthcare professionals, and the appropriate trial site investigator, because taking part in a clinical trial is a really personal decision, and there are lots of different factors to consider.
Thank you very much. And I'll meet you.
Thank you. So the next one for solid, so do we
Well, we can
is someone else willing to take on this one? So how do we, pharmaceutical companies, ensure that DMD families are fully aware of the adverse events of research medication? I think we have a taker.
We have a volunteer. So that is a very important part of the clinical trial process, the informed consent. And the informed consent, I realize, is a many-page document that you see at the beginning of the trial. But that's not really the informed consent. That document goes through the known side effects of the drug at the time that the participant, the family, is joining that study. But the informed consent is not just that piece of paper at the beginning, it's actually a process. So if new adverse events become, that are meaningful, become apparent during the study, then you may need to sign another informed consent. In other words, the investigator sits down and goes through the new information that's available. And then again, that needs to be acknowledged. So it is not just at the beginning, here's the information, but there is a process how additional information that is important for the safety of the drug and the monitoring of the drug during that trial becomes available to the families in that trial.
Thank you very much. Anyone else has anything to add to that? No. Very comprehensive.
So the next question is for Sarepta. For families who travel from a distance to get their child to a clinical center, will companies consider offering support with accommodation and travel?
Yes. We do, as I'm sure other sponsors do as well. But and if you have experience contrary to that, please do let me know. There are some international variations in what's approvable by ethics committees. No one should be financially rewarded for participating in a trial, but we do, wherever possible, try to compensate expenses incurred. And I think it kind of reflects on the broader question of equity to access in clinical trials. We are very aware that our trials are probably not equitably accessed at the moment, and that there are other challenges, not just accommodation and travel, but people who work for a wage in a way that they cannot just take time off, or that they will lose money by taking time off. Families with multiple siblings where you'll have to pay childcare costs for the other children. And that's something that we're working really hard to try to fix. We already try to pay where we can costs up front, so travel and accommodations up front, so that families don't have to spend and then be reimbursed. And we are working to see if we can try to solve some of these other issues around cost. Just because it's, I think, appropriate, another shout out to Emma and DMD Hub, because I think that geography also poses a big inequity to access to gene therapy trials, and I think that the centralized recruitment is a fantastic program.
Joanne, do you want to briefly also comment? Yeah.
1 minute.
So this goes back to what advocacy organizations can do, and in the United States, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy pulled together the pharmaceutical companies to create kind of a standard document which says this is what should be provided, that patients coming for screening visits should be covered in terms of their expenses. Expenses should be covered up front with a debit card or something that the patients aren't paying out of pocket and get money back or don't have to get money back later. And that additional support should be provided for all of these categories so that all of the companies have the same playbook to follow. And I think that's helpful to make sure that everybody is doing the right thing here.
Thank you for that addition. The next one is for Roche. What is the DMD family and advocacy group's role put into consideration of outcome measures, inclusion criteria of novel medical research trials? So I last minute stand-in for Francesco, so sorry for misreading this question. What is the DMD family and advocacy group's role put into consideration of outcome measure and inclusion criteria of novel medical research trials? I still don't get the question, but I'm sure you have an answer to it.
We have an answer to that question. So I think this question beautifully builds on what Ione from Pfizer was discussing in terms of how any pharmaceutical company works extensively with and supported by the whole clinical community. So in Roche, we have many clinical trials, whether that's across neuromuscular or rare disease. And we look constantly for the input of people who either are caring for people with conditions or are living with the condition to be able to input into whether it be the trial protocol or the outcome measures that we need, or in terms of how the clinical trial is going to operate within a clinical trial setting. We work very closely with the Community Advisory Board, which is obviously, if you're very aware of the World Duchenne Organization has this board. It's absolutely wonderful, and it's been set up for industry to be able to engage with the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community so that we can get the support and information and insights that we need to be able to develop the clinical trial programs. So that's one of the routes. It has 11 countries represented by both people who have the condition or those who are looking after children with the condition, and also patient organizations. They're not there representing themselves, they're representing the whole community across the globe. So that very much we seek to both bring suggestions around the trial, clinical trial protocols and the information that we need, and also to get the information across the board. In Roche, we've also organised a clinical advisory board, which looks to seek to bring some of the patient organisations across Europe and the rest of the world. And again, looking for both in terms of feedback on study execution and overall the on-site experience of people with the condition and families who are taking part in the clinical trial. One of the examples of how we've got a lot of support from both Action Duchenne and Duchenne UK is actually around one of the digital wearable devices that we've developed to try and assess mobility and ambulatory with boys who've got Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And this has been a fantastic piece of work, and it's been acknowledged by the EMA as being, the word is it's qualified. So in other words, it's been assessed as being okay, and it's a good way of actually assessing mobility. But one of the other areas in terms of ensuring that families are represented and their thoughts are included is making sure that we have access is equitable. So both
Time, Wendy.
Can I finish this one? Thank you. In terms of equitable, and this is something that we need to bring to the fore. And one of the things that Roche has been doing is working with the National Health and Care Research to bring a race equality framework to life. And this is very much in the UK. We have a dearth and a gap in people both who have got Black African background, Asian and Caribbean heritage to participate in clinical trials. And this is something that we're very much bringing into the work that we want to do.
Thank you. And the next one.
I thought the next one was yours. But
Was it?
I
Well,
prepared the one after this.
Actually, I
via
just
email.
got a signal from
Okay.
my team that I have to
You
leave
need
as
to
well.
leave. I'll do
I
this
still
one.
need to travel to the northeast of England,
Okay,
so I'll leave it in your hands. Thank you very much so far for your comments. I very much enjoyed them, actually.
Okay, thank you, Volker. The next one for Sarepta Are there any plans to get emotional and mental support in place for families undertaking clinical trials?
So thank you particularly for this question. So thank you for all the questions, but this question particularly because it really made me think and reflect on what we're doing. And I think the answer is we're not doing enough. So there are some emotional and mental health support measures in some of Sarepta's trials, but I think it's inconsistent and insufficient at present. And sometimes I think we race so quickly to try to get to the end of something that we don't consider how we best support people on that journey. So meetings like this, and I'll just reflect on a theme, are hugely important for getting that feedback from the community, and we do that through many channels, not just through the Great Wave Action Duchenne, but through our interactions with our Duchenne Community Advisory Board and other patient groups around the world. But all I can say is thank you, and we'll do better.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think it's not just in the UK, this is something that I hear everywhere for all rare disease patients, that participating in a trial is well, burden and can be emotional. The next one is for Santhera. When will manifesting girls, so I think the new phrase is women with dystrophinopathy, when will they be considered for clinical trials?
Thank you. This is not an easy question, and not easy, at least not easy to answer. And because let's face it, thus far Duchenne drug development has not been very inclusive in this aspect. When you design clinical trials, you start with safety. Yeah? To start with, it's about safety and efficacy. And the males and females, they are different in their responses to treatments. For instance, women are 50 to 75% more likely than men to experience drug adverse drug reactions. Also, males weigh more than females, generally speaking, but few drugs are weight-based. Although in Duchenne it's a bit different, but yeah. Then there's clearance of drugs and all these things that are different between the sexes. A special thing is reproductive toxicology, which you need to test for specifically, of course. But those things can be taken into account. The question is more around the fact that although I understand that up to 20% of female carriers may experience symptoms, these symptoms can range from mild skeletal and cardiac weakness to severe muscle weakness and significant cardiac involvement. And then on top of that, that can start in childhood or in adulthood. So for studies, the choice of efficacy endpoints is really the big challenge in manifesting girls. I may still call them like this. Yeah? Given the rarity of the condition, the variability in the expression, the variable age of onset of the symptoms, and the variable course of the disease. So defining the exact condition to be treated and the desired outcome is what needs to happen before girls can become eligible for a trial. But there's more. So if in short, one of the very important specific things for those girls that you need to do, of course, is the reproductive toxicology. But as I said, that can be done. But then we will need to define the endpoints. And we discussed endpoints already. In the short and narrow, you need to define what you want to treat and what sort of effect you want to see. And that is the really complex thing. Because
5 seconds.
Yeah. The endpoints need to be established and also need to be acknowledged by authorities. And only then this can be designed.
No, I think in summary, it's very complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah.
For Roche, if money wasn't an issue and you had all the greatest head of Duchenne research and care clinicians in one room, what sort of things would you agree on that every patient should have access to receive the best possible care and treatment out there?
I have only 3 minutes.
You have only 3 minutes.
So
2:55 now.
So I think in terms of looking at, if we could wave a magic wand and we could achieve what we all want to achieve, it's about for every person with Duchenne muscular dystrophy to have access to, equitable access to the best standard of care, no matter where you live, no matter how far you are away from the centre, no matter how old you are. And I think in particular, in terms of making sure that we have joined up services, that the care is also being developed from a personalised perspective, so it's exactly what you need and you want. We also need to make sure that that joined up care is not just from a healthcare perspective, but also across our health and social care, which is really critical to make sure, as you all know, the care and the support that each individual person with DMD needs. One of the things that happened recently in 2021 was that the government launched a rare disease framework. Now, this strategy had 4 particular pillars. One was around looking at improving access to specialist care. The second was increasing healthcare professional awareness of rare disease generally. The third, in terms of coordinating care for people with a rare disease. And then finally, it was around access to specialist treatments and medication. Now, for us, we were really, really pleased that we had this framework. And each of the 4 nations has now built their own action plan. And one of the things that we do know we do need is we need that action plan implemented. One of the areas for us that we're particularly concerned about is around the implementation of the coordination of care. I don't need to say that Duchenne is an exceptionally complex condition with a huge multidisciplinary team and the need to actually access care across many different disciplines. And it's critical that we get that care coordinated to make sure that every person with the condition achieves the best outcomes that they possibly can. Now, I think what we've heard over yesterday and today was about the brilliant work that DMD Care UK has been doing. And you can see some of the overlaps in terms of what the Rare Disease Framework is trying to do with some of the wonderful work that they're doing around ensuring that clinicians have an understanding of what Duchenne is. They understand what this rare disease is, that there is a consensus in what that standard of care should be. And also in terms of the wonderful app, in terms of making sure that if you are going into a centre, that you have an app to be able to ensure that you've got access, that the clinician who's treating you in an emergency setting has got access to the right information. And if I can just make one final point, and it's to say thank you, because any family taking part in a clinical trial it's a sacrifice, and it is hard work, and we know that. And we know that hopefully all of my colleagues here on stage would join me in saying that we know that we want to all achieve the same goal that you want to, and it's only with that sacrifice and that hard work that you do that we can work together to hopefully make that a reality.
Glad to give you an extra 45 seconds to make that statement. Next one is for Joanne again. If we fast forward to 10 years from now and you're sitting here at this exact same event with the same people, what do you think you will be saying?
Well, first of all, that was very well put, the appreciation that we have. So I've been in this field for a number of years, and it's very interesting to hear how the conversation has changed over the last several years. I think that what we are realizing is that these treatments need to be used together. And what we are going to be looking at, hopefully, is how to fit the puzzle pieces together in 10 years. So having multiple treatments, and now what's the best way to use them? What's the time to start them? How do we layer them on to get to the best possible outcome? Because I think we know now that one treatment is not going to do it by itself. That we need to work together, essentially, all putting new treatments out there to be able to make this disease better for the patients and for the families. So we're already doing combination treatment in the sense that the treatments are built on top of steroids. So in an ideal world, we could move these around and start to take away steroids if we have multiple other treatments to be able to address the disease. So that's where I would hope we would be in 10 years.
Okay, thank you very much. And you made up for the 45 seconds that we went over, but it was a very good point made. So again, happy to allow that. This one is for PTC. It's not here, but probably someone else will want to take it, because do Pharmaceutical communicate with each other? And if so, then how do they communicate? Well, I know that you're communicating to each other. Is there anyone who wants to explain how that happens?
I mean, I can talk to one example. I think there are challenges from a legal perspective in how you communicate with other companies, but there are also very important situations when we do need to communicate with one another, and I think that the emerging safety profile of gene therapies is one of those. We're in an area where pretty much everything we do is new and often unexpected, and our number of people in our trials is still relatively small, and by sharing information between trials and increasing that N, we get a better understanding of perhaps some of the mechanisms of what's driving these adverse events and how we might be able to better look for them in trials, how we may be able to change our trial criteria to make sure that we are conducting these trials as safely as possible. So there has been led by Professor Montoni, who sadly isn't here, but a collaboration between a number of the gene therapy developers in Duchenne to bring together information around these rare adverse events related to patients' underlying mutation, most likely. So it is not common, but I think it is necessary, and I think that this is a very good example and hopefully something that we can build on.
Yeah. So when patient safety is into account, then you definitely talk to each other. And maybe, since there's 1.5 minutes left, there's probably also common gaps and common problems, like how do you select outcome measures, or which outcome measures, developing new outcome measures that, I mean, are pre-competitive, and that you also, you're nodding, so I think that you agree that this is something that you can collaborate on and facilitate jointly. Yeah, I see you nodding, so in view of time, we're gonna move next. This one is to Solid, which is also not here. What does the DMD community need to do to get more drugs to non-ambulatory men and boys and younger men? Anyone wants to take that one on? I don't want to put you on the spot, because I mean, I'm seeing the question also now for the first time. And yeah.
The most simple answer to this would be do more studies. Yeah? But that's not good enough, I think, as an answer. We have to realize that the more advanced the disease, the more limited your options. Yeah? So it's difficult to get more studies out there. But at the same time, we've heard today that upper body functioning, for instance, is more and more acknowledged. Whereas initially, it was all about walking, keeping your ambulatory status. And so I think we will see a shift. I've already seen it today with the trials that you're doing displayed. Yeah? And so the only thing then is indeed do more studies.
Yeah. So maybe to elaborate, so you need, if you want to use an outcome measure, you need to have an outcome measure, and you need to know what that outcome measure does normally in the Duchenne population, and only then can you design your trial and power your trial. So it takes time.
I think that a very interesting field here is, for instance, respiratory and cardiac function. Those are typically fields with big unmet medical needs. They're typically very relevant in the non-ambulatory boys and young men.
Yes, I was going to reflect on some of the considerations we've had as we've been designing a non-ambulatory trial, and I think you've broadly covered them, that perhaps we don't have as good at outcomes and we don't have as good a natural history in the non-ambulatory population. I think maybe a more nuanced point is also around how we then get these drugs paid for. And so in the UK, as we do in lots of places, we use cost-effective analyses and we judge quality of life in people against a certain cost. And sadly, I think that is biased currently against the non-ambulatory population. People judge non-ambulatory quality of life in a very low fashion, and I think that's unfair. I think that we need to be better at understanding the value that can be brought to patients in a non-ambulatory state by preserving other really important functions.
And I would argue that if you're in a wheelchair, your arm function is even more important. So I think, yeah. And I'm also going to quote a Dutch Duchenne patient, walking is overrated. So, and I think, well, probably if you're walking, then you don't appreciate it. Once you're in a wheelchair, arm function is more important. So I'm going to agree with that. And I think this is the point. So one of the things that I've learned from Duchenne patients is that their quality of life is not different from us. And you value your life, and I think that is something that we need to get across to these people that do these cost-effectiveness study, rather than looking at it from their perspective and applying their perspective on the quality of life. But that's something that we don't have time to go into. I think this is the last question to PTC, not there. So whoever wants to take it, you have 3 minutes because then the session ends. What can patient organizations and family do to support your, so a company's efforts? Joanne, 3 minutes.
I talked before about patient advocacy organizations, so I won't add to that. But I think that one of the, I think that I'm probably preaching to the converted here, that's incredibly important is to participate in clinical trials. We know it's a sacrifice. We try to minimize the burden. But that's how the field advances. And we know that that's one of the things that takes a long time during development is to recruit into clinical trials. And there's a lot of reasons why that is slow, but that is really important in terms of advancing therapies. We can't advance therapies until we know how patients react to them.
Okay, anyone has anything to add? We have 2 minutes left.
I would just add in terms of the clinical trials that it would be from what we saw yesterday with so many clinical trials struggling to recruit and natural history studies or those that haven't got interventions. And again, I think it's just the fantastic work that the DMD Hub do with its goal of increasing participation would be fantastic.
Anyone, anything to add? If not, then thank you all very much. This was the last questions. And thank you for also taking the questions that you didn't prepare. Thank you for sitting here. And I think this ends the session, and I'm not sure whether there's any housekeeping rules, but let's first give an applause to the panel.